Let's now look at example number 14. Current liabilities include accrued fines and penalties with a carrying amount of rupees 100. The fines and penalties are not deductible for tax purposes. All right. So the question is mentioning that the current liabilities includes accrued fines and penalties of amount 100 rupees. So that means that I have actually incurred these fines, but I have not paid these fines. All right. Because it's outstanding on my balance sheet, it means that I've actually incurred these fines, but I'm yet to pay them. Probably I'll pay them in the next year. These fines and penalties the question is mentioning are not deductible for tax purposes. First, let's actually jot down the accounting entries in the books of accounts. Let's jot down the journal entries in the books of accounts. All right, the journal entry in the books of accounts would be I have incurred a penalty expense. All right, so I will basically debit penalty expense of rupees 100 and I am going to credit two accrued expenses of rupees 100. All right, so this is the journal entry in year one. This is the journal entry in the books of accounts. I debit penalty expense of 100 rupees, which is basically going to be reported in my P&L, and accrued expenses, which is my balance sheet item, is going to be credited. All right, so this is being reported on the balance sheet at an amount of rupees 100. So if I draw the balance sheet for year one, the balance sheet would include under the liabilities section accrued fines and penalties. It would include accrued fines and penalties of rupees 100. All right, so this is how the first year balance sheet would actually look like, and this is the accounting balance sheet. All right. In year two, I would be basically paying these fines and penalties. All right. I would be paying these fines and penalties. Therefore, in year two, I would be debiting the accrued expenses. All right. In year one, I created a provision, I created an accrual. In year two, I'm actually paying it. Therefore, I debit accrued expenses and I credit bank of rupees 100. All right. So in year two, I debit accrued expenses because I'm now settling the obligation, I'm settling the liability. So I debit accrued expenses and I credit bank. If I prepare a balance sheet at the end of year two, the balance sheet at the end of year two will have a row called as accrued expenses or accrued fines and penalties, but the carrying amount is actually going to be equal to zero. For year two, the balance sheet will have a zero carrying amount because I had an obligation of 100, I settled the obligation. Therefore, my accrued expenses is actually going to be zero as at the balance sheet date for year two. These were the journal entries in the accounting books. These were the journal entries in the accounting books. Let's actually look at the journal entries in the tax books of accounts. Let's actually look at the journal entries in the tax books of accounts. Now, if you think of it, in the tax books of accounts, the question is mentioned that these fines and penalties are actually not deductible. These fines and penalties are actually not deductible. All right. So because the tax laws are actually stating that these fines and penalties are not allowed as a tax deduction, these fines and penalties are not allowed as a deduction for tax purposes, I cannot debit P&L. Remember, I debit P&L only if the expense is allowed as a deduction. I debit my P&L only when the expense is actually allowed as a deduction. If you remember, in the earlier examples that we were doing, we used to debit the amount of expense. We used to debit expense in tax books only when the amount was actually allowed as a deduction. Over here, the amount is actually not allowed as a deduction. The amount is not recognized as an item which is eligible for deduction. Therefore, I actually cannot debit P&L. I cannot debit P&L because as per tax laws, this item is actually not being allowed as a deduction. Only items which are being allowed as a deduction will be debited to P&L. Therefore, over here I cannot debit my tax P&L. I cannot debit my P&L in tax books of accounts. But obviously, I need to debit something, right? Like if I'm not debiting P&L, I should debit something, right? Can it be an asset? The answer is no. Again, I cannot debit any other asset because it's actually not in the nature of asset. If I cannot debit expense and if I cannot debit asset, then what am I going to do is the question. I am actually just passing a journal, let us say as suspense account debit. I'm just parking it in suspense account debit of 100 and I am creating a liability of accrued expenses of 100 rupees. All right. I am actually just parking it into the suspense. I cannot recognize this as a P&L item because as per tax laws, this item is not recognized as a P&L item. This item is not eligible for deduction. Therefore, this item cannot be recognized as part of P&L in the tax books of accounts. Therefore, I'm parking it to an account called a suspense account. Randomly, I'm actually parking it to a suspense account. Obviously, you might be thinking, how can I debit suspense account? Suspense account cannot really exist, right? My answer to that is you actually do not have anything in reality called as tax books of accounts. Tax books of accounts itself is a hypothetical books of accounts. So therefore, as part of tax books of accounts, it's fine to, even if you have something called as suspense account, you're not reporting this anywhere as such. All right. In the hypothetical tax books of accounts, you cannot debit it to P&L because this item is not eligible for deduction. Therefore, I'm parking it to a suspense account. All right. So I'm parking it to a suspense account of rupees 100. If I prepare the balance sheet, if I prepare the tax balance sheet at the end of year one, if I prepare the tax balance sheet at the end of year one, I will actually have a debit balance in suspense account. I will have a debit balance in suspense account of 100. This will be reported, let's say, as part of assets. Debit balance is basically assets. Now, as part of liabilities, I will have accrued expenses of 100 rupees. I'm going to have accrued expenses of rupees 100. All right. So this is going to be my tax balance sheet for year one. This will be my tax balance sheet for year one. In year two, this accrued expenses is actually going to be paid off. All right. This was the journal entry in year one. In year two, the accrued expenses or accrued fines and penalties is actually going to be paid off. Therefore, the journal entry will actually be the same as that of accounting. All right. So we are going to debit accrued expenses and we will be basically crediting cash. We are going to debit accrued expenses of 100 and we will be crediting cash of 100 rupees. All right. So this is going to be the journal entry in the tax books of accounts as well for year two. If I prepare the tax balance sheet for the end of year two, the tax balance sheet for year two, I will continue to have the asset of suspense account. I will continue to have suspense account as an asset of rupees 100 and I will be having under liabilities accrued expenses of 0. I'm not going to have any accrued expenses. I'm not going to actually have any accrued expenses because the liability has gone down to 0 even as per tax balance sheet. Even as per the tax books of accounts, the liability has been debited and it has gone down to 0. All right. Obviously, I'm not denoting cash. The other side of it would have been cash. I'm not writing that in the tax balance sheet. I'm not incorporating that in my tax balance sheet. Now, if you think of it, if I actually need to calculate the deferred tax for this item, if I need to calculate the deferred tax for accrued expenses, I am plotting year one and year two. I'm plotting year one and year two. I'm starting with, let us say, the carrying amount of accrued expenses. I'm starting with carrying amount of accrued expenses, which basically means the accounting value. How much is this value in the accounting books? It was 100 at the end of year one and 0 at the end of year two. All right, I had an outstanding liability at the end of year one of 100 rupees, and at the end of year two, it's actually equal to 0. The second is tax base of accrued expenses. What is the tax base of accrued expenses? So now we are actually going to look at the tax balance sheet. We are going to look at the tax balance sheet for year one. Accrued expenses had a tax base of 100 rupees. Accrued expenses was being carried at 100 rupees. Therefore, I'm plotting 100 rupees also over here. I'm plotting 100 rupees as tax base for year two. Accrued expenses had a tax base of 0. All right. So for year two, tax base is actually equal to 0. The third step is calculating the temporary difference. Temporary difference for year one and year two is going to be equal to 0. I have a carrying amount of 100. I have a tax base also of 100. Therefore, my temporary difference is actually equal to 0. If my temporary difference is 0, my DTA or DTL is actually going to be 0. All right, I'm not going to have any deferred tax asset or a deferred tax liability. So therefore, this type of liability, accrued expenses where or any accrued fines and penalties which are non-deductible for tax purposes, result in no DTA or DTL. Because there is going to be no temporary difference, it does not result in any creation of DTA or DTL. All right. So if I go back to the example, the question required us to calculate the tax base. The question had required us to calculate the tax base of accrued fines and penalty, which was equal to 100, and this is for year one. All right, this is basically for year one. And because the carrying amount is also 100 and tax base is also 100, the temporary difference is going to be equal to zero. And therefore, the deferred tax asset and deferred tax liability is actually going to be zero, even if the liability is outstanding, or even after payment also it's going to be zero, because we saw that in year two, both the carrying amount and the tax base were actually going down to zero. All right, so that is with regards to example number 14. All right, I'm just noting that this suspense account obviously is just a random account where you have parked the balance. This is just a random account where you have actually parked the balance, and there's going to be no further implication for this suspense account. All right, this suspense account is not, you're not going to report a tax balance sheet anywhere. Remember, what is going to be given to the investors and the shareholders is your accounting balance sheet only. Accounting balance sheet will not have suspense account. This tax balance sheet is a hypothetical balance sheet that we are preparing, and this suspense account, even if it is there, does not really mean anything. All right, the reason why we did not debit P&L over here is because this expense is not allowed as a deduction for tax purposes. Only expenses which are allowed as a deduction for tax purposes can be debited to the P&L as part of tax books of accounts. In tax books of accounts, only the items which are allowed as a deduction will actually go to the P&L. This is an item which is not going to be deductible. Therefore, we did not take it to the P&L account. All right, so with that, we are done with example number 14.